The crack of his hand against her face echoed across the entire bar before anyone could even understand what they were seeing. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell stood over the small woman in the faded hoodie, his chest heaving, his knuckles still stinging, and he grinned like a man who had just won something. "Sit down and shut up," he spat loud enough for every soldier in the room to hear. "Nobody talks to me like that, especially not some woman who wandered into the wrong bar." A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of her lip. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. And not one person in that room knew they had just struck one of the most decorated Navy SEAL legends alive. Before we go any further, if you believe that real strength is measured by self-control and not by cruelty, take a second right now to subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments which city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The bar was called The Anchor, and it sat at the edge of a dusty military town just outside San Diego, the kind of place where men who had seen too much came to forget for a few hours. The walls were covered with faded unit patches and photographs of soldiers who never made it home. On most nights, it was quiet, respectful, almost sacred. But on this particular night, the air was different because Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell had come in already angry, already loud, already looking for someone to remind him how important he was. I was 28 years old, a decorated Army Ranger with 2 combat deployments behind him, and lately his ego had grown faster than his record. He had 4 men around him, younger Rangers who laughed at every joke he made and refilled his glass every time he emptied it. They treated him like a king, and he had started to believe it. "You should have seen the look on the captain's face," Ryan was saying, slamming his glass on the table. "I told him straight to his face. I said, 'Sir, with all due respect, I've forgotten more about combat than you'll ever learn from a desk.'" The men around him roared with laughter. One of them, a kid named Doyle, slapped the table so hard the bottles jumped. That was when the door opened and Sarah Walker walked in. She was 34 years old, though the weariness in her eyes made her seem older that night. She wore jeans and a gray hoodie pulled halfway up, and her dark hair was tied back loosely. She had spent the afternoon at a memorial service for a teammate who had been killed 3 weeks earlier, a man she had trained beside for 9 years, and all she wanted was one quiet drink to honor him before she drove home alone. She didn't look at anyone. She walked straight to the far end of the bar, sat down on a worn leather stool, and lifted 2 fingers toward the bartender, an old Vietnam veteran named Mac who had owned the place for 30 years. "Whiskey," she said quietly, "whatever's good." Mac studied her for a long moment, the way old soldiers study one another, and something in her stillness made him pour from the better bottle without saying a word. He set the glass in front of her, and she wrapped both hands around it, but didn't drink. She just stared into it. For a few minutes, that should have been the end of it. A tired woman, a quiet drink, a memory of a fallen friend. But Ryan Mitchell had a sense for any audience he didn't already own. And the moment he noticed a woman sitting alone ignoring his table, something inside him itched. "Hey," he called out. "Hey, sweetheart." Sarah didn't move. "I'm talking to you," but Ryan's voice climbed louder. "Lady in the hoodie, you lost. This isn't a place for civilians. This is a soldier's bar." Sarah lifted the glass, took a small sip, and set it back down. She still didn't turn around. Doyle leaned in toward Ryan. "She's ignoring you, man," he laughed. That was exactly the wrong thing to say. Ryan Mitchell had never in his life been able to stand being ignored. He pushed back his chair and walked across the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and he leaned against the bar right next to her, far too close. "You know what I think," he said, his breath thick with alcohol. "I think you came in here looking for attention. Pretty thing like you sitting all alone, so I'm gonna do you a favor and give you some." Sarah finally turned her head and she looked at him. Not with fear, not with anger, just a calm, level gaze, the kind that should have warned any man with sense to walk away. "I came in for one drink," she said softly. "To remember someone. I'd appreciate being left alone." "To remember someone?" Ryan laughed and looked back at his table. "You hear that, boys? She's having a moment." He turned back to her, and his smile faded into something uglier. "Let me guess. Boyfriend, husband, some guy who couldn't take care of you, so now you're drowning your sorrows." Mac, the bartender, set down the glass he was cleaning. "Sergeant, that's enough. Let the lady drink in peace. Stay out of it, old man." Sarah closed her eyes for just a second, and when she opened them, her voice was still calm, but there was iron underneath it now. "I'm asking you nicely, one time. Go back to your friends. Have your night. Forget I'm here." The whole bar had gone quiet by now. The other patrons, mostly older veterans, had stopped their conversations and were watching. They could feel it, that crackle in the air right before something breaks. And Ryan Mitchell felt it too, but instead of backing down, it fed him. Because in his mind, every eye in the room was now watching to see what the big bad ranger would do, and he had never once in his life chosen the quiet path when the loud one got more applause. "You're asking me," he repeated, mocking her tone. "You're giving me orders in a soldier's bar. You know what we do with people who don't show respect." "I know exactly what real soldiers do," Sarah said, "and it's not this." Something about the steadiness in her voice cut him deeper than any insult could have. His face flushed red. The laughter from his table had died, and now even his own men looked uncertain, glancing at one another, sensing that their leader had wandered somewhere he shouldn't. "Ryan, come on," Doyle said quietly from across the room. "Leave her alone, man. Let's just drink." But it was too late. Ryan's pride had taken the wheel. "Stand up," he said. Sarah didn't move. "I said stand up." He grabbed the edge of her stool and yanked it half around. "When a ranger tells you to do something, you do it." Mac came around the bar fast for an old man. "Get your hands off her, right now, or I'm calling the sheriff." "Call him?" Ryan snapped, not even looking at him. His eyes were locked on Sarah, and there was a wild, ugly heat in them now. The heat of a man who has gone too far to back out without losing face. "She thinks she's better than us. Sitting there judging us, well, let's see how tough she really is." Sarah slowly stood up off the stool. She was at least 6 inches shorter than him, slight in build, and to everyone watching, she looked impossibly fragile next to the broad-shouldered ranger. She lifted both her hands, palms open, the universal gesture of a person who wants no fight. "Last chance," she said quietly, and her eyes never left his. "Walk away. You'll thank yourself later." And maybe it was those words. Maybe it was the calm. Maybe it was the way she didn't tremble, didn't beg, didn't give him the fear he needed to feel like a king. Whatever it was, it snapped something loose in Ryan Mitchell, and before anyone could stop him, his hand came up and across, and he struck her hard across the face. The sound of it cut through the bar like a gunshot. Sarah's head turned with the blow. She took one step back to catch her balance, and then the room froze, every single person staring, because they had all just watched a decorated soldier strike an unarmed woman. A thin line of blood welled up at the corner of her mouth. Mac shouted something. A couple of the older veterans rose halfway out of their chairs. Doyle was on his feet now, too, his face pale. "Ryan, what the hell? What did you just do?" But Ryan stood there, breathing hard, his chest puffed out, trying to hold on to the feeling of victory, even as some animal part of his brain whispered that he had just done something he could never take back. And Sarah Walker simply lifted one hand slowly and wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her thumb. She looked at the red smear for a moment. Then she looked back up at Ryan, and there was no rage in her face, no tears, just a deep, quiet sadness, almost like pity. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "Yeah," Ryan sneered, though his voice cracked just slightly. "What are you going to do about it?" Sarah held his gaze for a long, long moment. The whole bar waited, and then she did the last thing anyone expected. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a few bills, and laid them gently on the bar next to her untouched drink. "Nothing," she said. "Tonight I'm going to do nothing." She turned and walked toward the door. Her steps were steady and unhurried, and at the threshold she paused, her hand on the frame, and she looked back over her shoulder at him one final time. "Get a good night's sleep, Sergeant," she said. "You're going to need it." Then she was gone, the door swinging shut behind her, and the bar erupted into noise. Mac was shouting at Ryan to get out. The older veterans were cursing him, telling him he'd disgraced the uniform. Doyle had his hands on his head, muttering, "We are so screwed, man. We are so screwed." But Ryan, drunk and proud and certain he had won, just laughed it off. "Relax," he told his men, dropping back into his chair. "She's nobody. Just some woman. You saw her. She ran out crying. We'll never see her again." He was wrong about almost everything that night, but he was most wrong about that. What Ryan Mitchell did not know, what nobody in that bar could have known, was who Sarah Walker actually was. They saw a small woman in a hoodie. They did not see 15 years of service that had taken her to places most soldiers could not find on a map. They did not see the operations that were still classified, the ones her own family would never hear about. They did not see the medals locked away in a drawer at home, including two she had been ordered to never speak of in public. They did not see a woman who had trained the trainers, who had walked into situations where the odds were so impossible that command had told her not to go, and who had walked back out alive when the men who sent her had already written the condolence letters. They did not see Commander Sarah Walker, one of the few women ever to reach the highest tier of American Special Operations, a name spoken in low, reverent tones by the operators who knew the truth. And they certainly did not know what was scheduled to begin the very next morning, less than 15 miles from that bar at a Joint Forces Advanced Training Facility, where 12 hand-picked Army Rangers were about to meet the elite instructor who would put them through the hardest week of their lives. But that knowledge was still hours away. For now, Sarah sat alone in her truck in the parking lot, her hands resting on the steering wheel, the engine off. She did not start it right away. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror, at the blood she had wiped away, at the faint redness blooming across her cheek where his hand had landed. And she did not feel angry. That surprised people when they learned it later. She did not drive home plotting revenge. She had stopped letting her ego make her decisions a long time ago, in a place very far from California on a day she would never fully be able to forget. Instead, she felt something closer to grief, because she had seen 1,000 men like Ryan Mitchell, young, strong, talented, and so blinded by pride that they could not see the cliff they were walking toward. She had seen what happened to men like that when they finally met something they could not bully. Some of them broke, a few of them learned, and the ones who learned, who truly learned, became the kind of soldiers you would trust with your life. She wondered which one Ryan would be. She started the truck, and as she pulled out of the lot, she whispered something to herself, the same thing she whispered every night before a new class began. Let me reach them in time. Back inside the bar, Doyle finally got Ryan to listen. You don't get it, Doyle was saying, gripping his arm. I've seen that look before, on guys who know things. She wasn't scared, Ryan. Did you see her hands? Did you see how she stood? That woman has been in fights that would make you and me wet ourselves. And she walked away. Why do you think she walked away? Because she's a coward, Ryan said. Doyle shook his head slowly. No, man, I think she walked away because if she hadn't, she'd have hurt you so bad, you'd never put a uniform on again. And for some reason, she didn't want to do that. For just a second, a flicker of doubt crossed Ryan's face. Just a second. Then he buried it under another swallow of whiskey and another laugh. You're paranoid, he said. Tomorrow we start that joint training thing. New instructor, some hotshot from another unit. We're going to run circles around whoever it is, just like we always do. And we are never, ever going to think about that woman again. Doyle didn't answer. He just stared at the door she had walked out of with a sick feeling growing in the pit of his stomach, the kind of feeling soldiers learn never to ignore. Old Mac, wiping down the bar with a rag, had heard the whole exchange. And the old Vietnam veteran, who had seen more in his life than any of these young men could imagine, just shook his head and said low enough that only he could hear it, Son, you've got no idea what's coming. The night went on. Ryan drank more, laughed more, told the story of how he put that woman in her place, at least 3 more times, each version a little grander than the last. By the time his friends poured him into a cab, he had nearly convinced himself it was the funniest thing that had ever happened. But somewhere underneath all that whiskey and all that pride, a small, cold voice he could not quite silence kept asking the same question. Why did she smile when she said he'd need a good night's sleep? Why did it sound less like a threat and more like a promise? He would have his answer at 0600 the next morning, and it would be the most humbling moment of his entire life. That night, Ryan Mitchell slept hard the way drunk men do, dreaming of nothing. His phone alarm screamed at 5 o'clock, and he silenced it with a curse, his head pounding, his mouth dry. He pulled on his uniform, his fingers fumbling with the buttons, and he looked at himself in the mirror, at the strong jaw and the broad shoulders and the chest full of ribbons, and he told himself the same thing he told himself every morning, that he was one of the best, that nobody could touch him. That respect was something you took, not something you earned. His knuckles still ached just slightly from where they had struck a woman's face the night before. He flexed his hand and ignored the feeling. He grabbed his gear, and as he headed out the door into the gray morning light, he had no way of knowing that within the hour he would walk into a briefing room, take his seat among 11 other confident, smirking Rangers, and watch the door at the front of the room swing open. I had no way of knowing that the figure standing there wearing the insignia of one of the most elite special operations units in the entire United States military would be the same small woman from the bar. He had no way of knowing that the faint bruise still visible on her cheek, the one his own hand had put there, would be the last thing he ever expected to see on the face of his new instructor. And he had no way of knowing that the question Doyle had asked him, the one he had laughed off, was about to be answered in a way that would change the course of his entire life. Because Commander Sarah Walker had not gone home that night to nurse a grudge. She had gone home to prepare. She had laid out her uniform. She had reviewed the files of all 12 men she would be training, including one Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell, and decorated, talented, and dangerously, fatally proud. And she had decided, sitting alone in the quiet of her kitchen with an ice pack against her cheek, exactly what kind of lesson these men needed to learn. Not a lesson in pain. They already knew pain. Not a lesson in fear. Fear was easy. A lesson in humility. The hardest lesson of all. The one that had cost her the most to learn. The one a teammate had died for her to finally understand. She finished her coffee in the dark, rinsed the cup, set it carefully in the rack, and looked out the window at the first thin light of dawn breaking over the hills. "All right," she said quietly to the empty room. "Let's see what you're made of, Sergeant Mitchell." And 15 miles away, climbing into his truck with a hangover and a head full of pride, Ryan Mitchell had absolutely no idea that the worst mistake of his life had already been made, and that the woman he had struck in front of an entire bar was about to become the most important teacher he would ever have. The sun came up over the training facility. The trucks rolled in. 12 Rangers filed into the briefing room, laughing, joking, certain of their own greatness. And at exactly 6 o'clock, the door at the front of the room began to open. The door opened, and the laughter died. Ryan Mitchell was mid-sentence, leaning back in his chair, telling Doyle some story about a woman he'd handled the night before when the figure stepped through the doorway at the front of the briefing room. And for one full second, his brain simply refused to process what his eyes were telling him. Because the woman standing there, spine straight, hands clasped behind her back, was the same woman from the anchor. The same gray eyes, the same dark hair, though now it was pulled back tight and clean. The same faint bruise blooming along her cheekbone, the bruise his own hand had put there 12 hours ago. Except now she was not wearing a faded hoodie. She was wearing a uniform, and on that uniform was an insignia that every man in that room recognized instantly, the kind of insignia that made hardened Rangers sit up a little straighter, the mark of one of the most elite and secretive special operations units in the entire United States military. The whiskey in Ryan's stomach turned to ice. "Good morning, gentlemen," Sarah said. Her voice was calm, even almost warm. "My name is Commander Sarah Walker. For the next 7 days, I'll be your instructor." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 11 Rangers slowly turned their heads to look at the 12th, at Ryan, who sat frozen in his chair, with his mouth slightly open and the color draining out of his face. Doyle beside him had gone completely rigid, and under his breath, barely moving his lips, he whispered the only thing his mind could form. Oh my God, Ryan, it's her." Ryan couldn't speak. His ears were ringing. He kept waiting for someone to say it was a joke, for the door to open again, and the real instructor to walk in. But there was no real instructor. There was only Sarah Walker standing at the front of the room looking directly at him. And here was the moment that broke him more than anything else, the moment that he would replay in his mind for years afterward. She didn't glare at him. She didn't smirk. She didn't call him out in front of the others, didn't say a single word about the bar, the insult, the slap. She just held his eyes for a heartbeat longer than the others, just long enough that he knew that she knew, and then she moved on, letting her gaze travel calmly across the rest of the room. That mercy was worse than any punishment, because now Ryan had to sit there sweating through his uniform, waiting to find out what she was going to do. "Some of you," Sarah continued, "are wondering why a Joint Forces program brought in an instructor from outside your branch. The answer is simple. You've gotten comfortable. You've gotten good at the things you're already good at. And comfort, gentlemen, is how soldiers die." She let that settle. "My job this week is to find the gap between what you think you are and what you actually are. And believe me, that gap is wider than any of you want to admit." A Ranger near the front, a thick-necked staff sergeant named Briggs, leaned over to his buddy and muttered something with a smirk. He thought he said it quietly. He did not. Sarah turned to him without missing a beat. "You have something to add, Sergeant Briggs." He startled. "No, ma'am." "You do. Say it to the room." Briggs hesitated, then decided to commit to the bravado. I just said, ma'am, no offense, but we're Rangers. We've all got real combat under our belts. I'm not sure what one operators are going to teach 12 of us in a week. Sarah nodded slowly as if this were a perfectly reasonable thing to say. That's a fair question. Let me answer it with a demonstration. She walked to the front table and unrolled a map. Here's the exercise. There's an objective at the north end of the training grounds. A flag marked and lit. Your mission is to stop me from reaching it. 12 of you, one of me. You can position yourselves anywhere on the field. You can use any non-lethal training gear in the armory. You have 1 hour to prepare, and I will give you a head start on the planning while I go put my boots on. The room erupted in barely contained grins. 12 elite rangers against one woman. It sounded like a gift. Briggs actually laughed out loud. Ma'am, with respect, that's not a fair fight. You're right, Sarah said, rolling the map back up. It isn't. And she walked out, leaving them to it. The second the door closed, the room exploded with confidence. Briggs was already drawing positions on the whiteboard. We blanket the whole approach. 2-man teams overlapping fields of fire. There's no way one person gets through 12 of us. We'll have her tagged in 90 seconds. But Doyle wasn't grinning. Doyle was staring at the door and his stomach was in knots. He grabbed Ryan's arm and pulled him to the side away from the others. Ryan, listen to me. We have to tell them. Tell them what? Ryan hissed. About last night, about the bar. That woman, that commander, you put your hand across her face in front of 40 witnesses. Do you understand what's happening right now? She's your instructor. She controls your evaluation. She controls your future. And you assaulted her. Ryan's jaw tightened. The fear was crawling up his spine, but his pride fought it down. She's not going to do anything. If she was going to report me, she'd have done it already. She had her chance in there, and she didn't say a word. That's exactly what scares me, Doyle whispered. She doesn't need to report you, man. She's going to handle it her own way. And we're all about to be standing right next to you when she does. Across the room, Briggs called out, Mitchell, Doyle, quit whispering and get over here. We're setting positions. Ryan pulled away from Doyle and walked over, forcing the swagger back into his step. But his hands had started to shake, and he shoved them in his pockets so no one would see. The hour passed in a blur of planning. 12 confident men laid a trap so thorough they were certain a ghost couldn't slip through it. They covered every approach lane. They set observers on the high ground. They built layers, a screen, a main line, a reserve. Briggs took command without anyone electing him, and Ryan, who normally would have fought for that role, found himself strangely quiet, his eyes drifting again and again toward the door. At exactly 7 o'clock, the exercise began. Sarah did not come from the south where they expected her. She did not come from any direction they had planned for. The first sign anything was wrong came when one of the high ground observers, a sharp kid named Park, simply stopped responding on the radio. Park, check in, Briggs said. Silence. Park, you copy. Then Park's voice came through, but flat, defeated. I'm tagged. She's already past the observation line. I never even saw her. A ripple of unease moved through the team. That's impossible, Briggs said. There's no cover up there. And then it began to unravel faster than any of them could have imagined. The radio became a graveyard. One by one, voices reported, in each one carrying the same disbelief. Tagged. I'm out. She came from behind me. How is she behind us? She's supposed to be in front. I'm tagged. Where did she even? Within 8 minutes, 4 Rangers were eliminated. Within 12, it was 7. And the terrible part, the part that crawled under their skin, was that not one of them had landed a single tag on her. She wasn't fighting them. She was dismantling them. She knew where they'd be before they got there. She read their radio chatter and used their own coordination against them, peeling them off the line one at a time, always appearing where they were weakest, never where they were strong. Briggs, sweating now, his confidence shredded, screamed into the radio. Everybody, hold position. Nobody move. Make her come to us. We collapse on her when she... He never finished the sentence. A calm voice spoke from directly behind him, close enough to touch. You moved your reserve too early, Sergeant. You left a gap on your left. I've been inside your perimeter for 4 minutes. Briggs spun around. Sarah was standing right there, not even breathing hard, and she reached out and tapped him gently on the shoulder. You're tagged. He just stared at her, defeated and stunned. How he managed. How did you? We had every lane covered. You covered the ground, Sarah said. You forgot to cover the way you think. 11 down, only one ranger left between Sarah and the flag, Ryan Mitchell. He had positioned himself at the very back closest to the objective, telling himself it was strategy, but knowing in his heart it was something else. And now as the radio went dead and the truth sank in that he was the last man standing, he felt his pulse hammering in his throat. He gripped his training rifle so hard his knuckles went white. He scanned the terrain, left, right behind him, his breath coming fast and shallow. Come on, he whispered to himself. Come on, I'm ready for you. I was not ready for her. A full minute passed, then two. The silence was its own kind of torture. He kept turning, kept searching, and the longer nothing happened, the more his nerve frayed until finally he couldn't take it anymore. And he shouted into the empty field, "Where are you? Come out and face me." "I'm right here, Sergeant." He spun toward the voice, raising his rifle, and she was standing maybe 20 feet away, completely in the open. Her hands relaxed at her sides, not even holding a weapon. She had walked right up to him and let him see her, and the bruise on her cheek caught the morning light. Ryan's finger trembled on the trigger. "Stay back, I mean it. I'll tag you." "Then tag me," Sarah said quietly. "I'm not moving. I'm not armed. Take your shot." And here was the moment that exposed everything. Ryan Mitchell, decorated Army Ranger, the man who had bragged for years about his nerve under fire, raised his rifle at an unarmed woman standing perfectly still, and he could not do it. His hands shook too badly. His vision blurred. Because the woman standing in front of him wasn't an enemy in his sights. She was the woman he had struck in a bar, looking at him with that same calm, sad expression. And somewhere deep down he understood, with a wave of nausea, that she had let it come down to this. She had eliminated 11 of the best rangers in the country without breaking a sweat, and she had saved him for last, and she had walked into the open and offered him a free shot because she wanted him to see in front of God and everyone exactly who had real control and who only ever pretended to. He pulled the trigger. He missed. She didn't. Before the training round had even finished its flight, she had closed the distance, swept the rifle out of his grip, with a motion so fast and so clean that he never saw her hands move, and tapped two fingers against his chest directly over his heart. "You're tagged," she said. "Exercise complete." And then so softly that only he could hear it. "That's twice now you've raised a hand to me, Sergeant. Both times I let you live. Think about why." She turned and walked the last 50 yards to the flag, lifted it from its post, and held it up. 11 defeated Rangers were jogging back in from the field, and they stopped one by one to watch, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. The whole thing had taken 19 minutes. 19 minutes for one woman to do what they would have sworn was impossible. 19 minutes to take 12 of the proudest men in the United States Army and show them with absolute clarity that they had never in their lives understood what the top of the mountain actually looked like. Sarah gathered them in a loose half circle. They were breathing hard, they were humiliated, and they were, for the first time, genuinely afraid not of getting hurt, but of how badly they had misjudged everything. "I want to be clear about something," she said, and her voice carried no triumph at all, only a flat, honest steadiness. "I didn't beat you because I'm stronger than you. I'm not. Sergeant Briggs could bench press me across this field. I didn't beat you because I'm faster or because I've got better gear or because I've seen more combat, though I've seen plenty. I beat you because while you were busy being certain, I was busy being curious. You knew you were going to win. That certainty made you blind. And blindness, gentlemen, is the only thing on this earth that can kill a good soldier faster than a bullet." She let that hang in the air. "You drew your positions to stop a person," she went on. "You never once asked what kind of person you were stopping. You assumed, and every single one of you is alive in this exercise today only because the rounds were rubber. In the real world, your assumptions would have come home in the 12 flag-draped boxes." The words landed like physical blows. Briggs was staring at the ground. Park's jaw was clenched, and Ryan Mitchell stood at the edge of the group, the spot over his heart still warm where her fingers had tapped him, and for the first time in his entire adult life, he had absolutely nothing to say. "Dismissed for 30 minutes, Sarah said. "Hydrate, reset. We start the next phase at 0800, and it gets harder from here. Much harder." The men scattered, quiet, and shaken, talking in low voices. But Doyle caught Ryan by the sleeve before he could slink off alone. "Now do you believe me?" Doyle said. There was no anger in it, only a kind of horrified vindication. "That's who you slapped, man. That's who you slapped in front of the whole bar. You put your hand across the face of a woman who just took apart the entire team in less time than it takes to eat lunch. Do you finally get it? Ryan didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared after Sarah as she walked back toward the building, her stride even and unhurried the same way she had walked out of the Anchor the night before. She could end your career with one phone call, Doyle pressed. One, and instead she's going to stand there and teach you for a week. Why? Why would she do that? I don't know, Ryan finally said, and his voice came out hollow, scraped clean of all its usual swagger. I don't know, Doyle, but that was a lie, because some part of him had already begun to understand, and it terrified him more than any exercise ever could. He remembered her words from the bar. Walk away. You'll thank yourself later. He remembered the way she said he'd need a good night's sleep, not as a threat, but almost like a teacher warning a student about an exam. And he remembered just now in the field, two fingers over his heart, and that quiet sentence that had cut deeper than the slap he'd given her had ever cut. Both times I let you live. Think about why. He found a bench at the edge of the lot and sat down hard, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. The hangover was gone, burned away by adrenaline, replaced by something far worse. Shame. Real shame, the kind he had spent years building walls against. And those walls were crumbling now, one stone at a time. I thought about every person he had bullied. Every recruit he had screamed at to feel big. Every time he had mistaken cruelty for strength and called it leadership. He thought about his own men, the ones who laughed at his jokes not because they were funny, but because they were scared of him. And he thought about the woman who had just had every reason on earth to humiliate him, to break him, to bury his career, and who had instead simply tapped him on the chest and told him to think about why she let him live. A shadow fell across the bench. Ryan looked up, expecting Doyle, but it was Sarah. She stood there for a moment looking down at him, and then she sat on the far end of the bench, leaving a careful space between them. She didn't look at him. She looked out at the training field where she had just dismantled his entire world. You couldn't pull the trigger, she said. Not a question. Ryan swallowed hard. I missed. No, Sarah said gently. You didn't miss because your aim was bad, Sergeant. You missed because for the first time you were looking at a human being instead of an obstacle. That's not weakness. She finally turned her head and looked at him, and there was no contempt in her eyes, none at all, and only something that looked almost like hope. That's the first real thing you've done all morning. Ryan's throat tightened. Why didn't you report me? He said the words barely above a whisper. Last night, you could have, you should have. Sarah was quiet for the long moment. Then she said, because reporting you would have ended your career, and ending your career would have taught you nothing except that you got caught. She stood up, brushing off her uniform. And I'm not in the business of ending careers, Sergeant Mitchell. I'm in the business of saving lives. Sometimes those are the same thing. Most of the time, they're not. She started to walk away. Then she stopped, and without turning around, she said one last thing, and it was the thing that finally completely broke through the wall. Ryan Mitchell had spent his whole life building. I had a teammate once who was a lot like you, she said quietly. Strong, proud, certain he was the best man in any room. I'm going to tell you what happened to him before this week is over. And when I do, you're going to understand exactly why I let you live. And then she walked back into the building, leaving Ryan alone on the bench with his heart pounding and a question burning a hole straight through his chest, a question he suddenly desperately needed answered. What happened to the teammate who was just like him? That question followed Ryan Mitchell into every hour of the days that came after, and Sarah Walker made sure those days were the hardest of his life. The next morning at 0500, before the sun was even a rumor on the horizon, she had the 12 of them standing in formation, and she laid out what was coming. For the rest of this week, she said, you will fail repeatedly, publicly. You will fail in ways that embarrass you, and I want you to pay attention to that embarrassment because it's the most honest teacher you'll ever have. Today is urban combat, a simulated building, multiple rooms, hostile contacts, civilians mixed in. Your job is to clear it. My job is to show you everything you don't know about clearing it, which as of right now is almost everything. Briggs, who 24 hours earlier would have rolled his eyes, said nothing. The lesson on the field had rearranged something in all of them. They entered that building convinced they knew how to clear a structure. They had done it 100 times, and within 90 seconds, Sarah's voice came over the speaker, calm and cutting. Sergeant Park, you just walked your team past an open doorway without clearing it. In a real building, the man in that room would have shot all 4 of you in the back. reset. They reset. They failed again. A different way this time. She caught Briggs stacking his men too tight on a corner. One grenade, Sergeant. One grenade and your entire stack is gone. You're thinking about speed. You should be thinking about spacing. Reset. Reset. Fail. Reset. Fail. By the third hour, the men were soaked in sweat and humiliation. And the worst part was that every single correction she made was right. She wasn't inventing flaws to humble them. She was showing them flaws that had been there all along, flaws they had survived only because luck had covered for them in the real world. And that realization that they had been getting by on luck and calling it skill was the thing that began to genuinely frighten them. Ryan threw himself into it harder than anyone. He volunteered to go first into every room. He pushed himself to exhaustion. And at first, Sarah said nothing about it. But around the fourth hour after Ryan had cleared a room with reckless, almost suicidal aggression, her voice came over the speaker, and it stopped him cold. Sergeant Mitchell, come outside, now. The other men exchanged glances. Ryan jogged out, breathing hard, expecting a correction, expecting a lecture. Instead, Sarah was waiting with her arms crossed, and she studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment. What are you doing? She asked. Clearing the building, ma'am. No, you're trying to win something. You're trying to prove something to me. You went into that last room with no backup and no plan because some part of you thinks if you're brave enough, fast enough, aggressive enough, it'll make up for the man you were in that bar. Her voice softened, but it didn't lose its edge. It won't. You can't out-courage your way past a mistake, Sergeant. That's just pride wearing a different uniform. Ryan's jaw worked. The accusation landed because it was true. Then what am I supposed to do? He said, and the frustration cracked his voice. Tell me what I'm supposed to do, because I don't know anymore. Everything I thought I knew about being good at this, you've taken apart in 2 days. Good, Sarah said. Now we can actually start. And here was a small turning point one Ryan almost missed in the moment, but would remember later, because for the first time she wasn't grading him as an instructor grades a student. She was talking to him the way a leader talks to someone she's decided is worth saving. Go back in there, and this time instead of trying to be the hero, try to make sure the man next to you comes home. That's the whole job, Sergeant. That's the only job. Everything else is ego. He went back in, and then something shifted. He stopped charging. He started covering. He started talking to his teammates instead of competing with them. And for the first time all day, his team cleared a floor without a single simulated casualty. When they finished, Doyle clapped him on the shoulder, grinning despite the exhaustion. That's the first time you've ever let me go through a door first without making it a contest, he said. Felt weird. Felt good but weird. Ryan almost smiled. Almost. The shame was still there. But underneath it, something new was growing, something he didn't have a word for yet. Day 3 was survival. Sarah dropped them in rough country with almost nothing and gave them a navigation problem that on paper should have been simple. It was not simple. She had designed it specifically to break the kind of men who relied on equipment and bravado instead of patience and humility. By nightfall, 4 of the teams were hopelessly lost. Tempers flared. Briggs and another sergeant nearly came to blows over a map reading. And it was Ryan of all people who stepped between them. Hey, knock it off. He grabbed Briggs by the vest and pulled him back. You want to fight each other out here? That's exactly what she wants. She's not testing whether we can read a map. She's testing whether we fall apart when things go wrong, so let's not fall apart. Briggs stared at him. So did the others, because this was not the Ryan Mitchell they knew. The old Ryan would have been the first one swinging. The old Ryan would have made it worse. And now here he was holding the team together. From a ridgeline a quarter mile away, Sarah watched the whole thing through a spotting scope, and a small private smile touched the corner of her mouth. She lowered the scope and said nothing to anyone, but she made a note. It was on the evening of the 4th day, with the men bone-tired and finally quiet sitting around in the low light after a brutal series of decision-making drills, that Ryan finally got his answer to the question that had haunted him since the bench. He found her alone cleaning gear, and he stood there for a moment before he worked up the nerve. Ma'am, you said you'd tell me about your teammate, the one who was like me. Sarah's hands went still on the gear. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and Ryan thought maybe he'd overstepped, maybe she'd changed her mind. Then she set the equipment down and gestured for him to sit. His name was Danny, she said quietly. Daniel Reyes. And you're right, he was a lot like you. Strong, funny, the best natural soldier I ever served with. and he knew it. That was the problem. He knew it. She paused, and Ryan saw something cross her face that he had never seen on her before. Not in the bar, not on the field, not once all week. Grief, raw and old and never fully healed. We were a team of 6. We'd been together almost 4 years. You don't just trust men like that. You love them. They become more than family. And Danny was the heart of us. Loudest laugh, biggest ego, but he'd have walked through fire for any one of us. Boitia. She turned the equipment over in her hands without really looking at it. We had a mission, the kind I can't talk about even now. And the intelligence was wrong, it happens. The situation on the ground wasn't what we were told. And the right call, the call every instinct in my body was screaming at me to make, was to abort. To pull back, regroup, come at it another way. Her voice tightened, but Danny didn't want to abort. Danny had been waiting for this one. And he looked at me and he said, Sarah, if we pull back now, we look weak. They'll think we couldn't hack it. And God help me, I was tired and I was proud too, and I didn't want to look weak either. So instead of overriding him, instead of doing my job and making the hard call, I let our pride make the decision for us. We pushed forward. Ryan sat very still. He could barely breathe. It went wrong in about 40 seconds, Sarah said, and her voice was steady, but her hands had begun to tremble just slightly. It went wrong exactly the way I knew it would, the way I'd felt in my gut it would. And Danny, who was always first through the door, who always had to prove he was the bravest man in the room, Danny went first. And he didn't come back out. She stopped, swallowed. I held him. At the end, he looked up at me, and you know what he said? He didn't say he was scared. I didn't ask about his family. He looked at me and he said, you were right. You were right, Sarah. I should have listened. And then he was gone. The silence after that was complete. Ryan realized his eyes were wet and didn't bother to hide it. I carried his body 4 miles, Sarah said. And every step of those 4 miles, I understood something I'd been too proud to understand before. That Danny didn't die because the enemy was good. He died because we were arrogant. Because 2 of the most experienced operators in the world let our egos make a decision that our training should have made. Because we cared more about not looking weak than we did about coming home alive. She finally looked up at Ryan and her eyes were fierce now, assuring her pride didn't just risk my life that day, Sergeant. It killed the best man I ever knew. And I have spent every single day since trying to make sure it doesn't kill anyone else. Ryan's voice came out broken. And then I walked into a bar and I slapped you across the face for telling me to leave you alone. Yes, Sarah said simply. You did. Why didn't you destroy me? You had every right. You'd have been justified. I would have deserved it. His voice was rising, the guilt pouring out of him. Anyone else would have. You could have put me in a hospital. You could have ended my career. Instead, what you decided to teach me. After what I did, I don't understand. I will never understand why you didn't make me pay for that. And here came the answer that reorganized everything inside Ryan Mitchell. The answer that he would carry for the rest of his life, that he would one day pass to soldiers of his own. Because making you pay would have been easy, Sarah said. And easy doesn't fix anything. Sergeant, I have hurt people in ways I will never tell you about, in ways I have to live with. I know exactly how much power I have to destroy a man. That's not strength. Anybody with enough rage and enough training can destroy. A wounded animal can destroy. She leaned forward. Real strength, the kind that's actually rare, the kind almost nobody has, is being able to destroy and choosing not to. It's having every reason in the world to hit back and deciding that you'd rather build something than break it. The night you hit me, I had a choice. I could have shown you what I'm capable of, or I could try to show you what you're capable of. And I made the second choice because I'd already learned the hard way, in the worst way there is, that proving I can hurt someone doesn't make me strong. It makes me Danny, and Danny is dead. Ryan put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. For the first time since he was a boy staff sergeant, Ryan Mitchell wept openly in front of the woman he had wronged, and she let him sitting quietly beside him, neither comforting him with false reassurance nor adding to his shame. When he could finally speak, his voice was raw. I've been doing it wrong, all of it. My whole career, I thought making people afraid of me was leadership. I thought being the loudest, the toughest, the meanest, I thought that was strength. My men don't respect me. They're scared of me. That's not the same thing. I never even knew it wasn't the same thing until this week. Now you know, Sarah said. The question is what you do with knowing. How do I fix it after everything? How do I even start? Sarah stood and she looked down at him, and there was something almost gentle in her face now. You already started. 2 days ago, you couldn't pull a trigger because you finally saw a human being. Yesterday, you held a team together that wanted to fall apart. Today, you went through doors thinking about the man beside you instead of yourself. You think I don't see all of that, Sergeant? I see everything. It's my job to see everything. She picked up her gear. You don't fix it with a speech or an apology. You fix it the way you fix everything that matters. One choice at a time, every single day, especially on the days when nobody's watching. And the prideful thing would be so much easier. That's the whole secret. There's nothing else to it. She started to walk. She would then stop. There's a final evaluation coming. Day 6. It's the hardest thing I'll put you through, and most of you won't make the cut. It's not designed to be passed by the strongest man. It's designed to be passed by the one who finally understands what this whole week was about. I don't know yet if that's you, but for the first time, Sergeant, I think it might be. And with that, she was gone, leaving Ryan Mitchell alone in the dim light, his face wet, his chest hollowed out, and somehow lighter all at once. The name Danny Reyes echoing in his mind, and a fierce, quiet resolve building in him that he had never felt before in his life. Not the desperate need to prove himself, but something steadier and deeper. The need to become worthy of the second chance. A woman he had struck in a bar had decided for reasons he was only beginning to understand to give him. He sat there a long time after she left. Doyle found him eventually and sat down beside him without a word. After a while, Doyle said, "You okay?" "No," Ryan said, "but I think I'm gonna be." He wiped his face and looked out into the dark. "Doyle, the way I've treated you, the way I've treated all the guys, I'm sorry, I mean it. I've been somebody I'm not proud of." Doyle was quiet for a moment, stunned, because in all the years he'd known Ryan, he had never once heard him apologize for anything. Then he clapped a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Took you long enough, you stubborn idiot," he said, but his voice was warm and there was relief in it, and maybe the start of something that had been missing between them for a very long time. 2 days remained before the final evaluation. 2 days for Ryan Mitchell to prove not to Sarah, not to the other men, but to himself that the lesson had taken root. And as he finally rose from that bench and walked back toward the barracks under a sky full of stars, he understood that the hardest test he would ever face wasn't the one Sarah had designed for day 6. It was the one he would face every day for the rest of his life. The battle she had warned him about without ever naming it yet. The quiet, endless war between the man he had been and the man he was only now beginning to become. Those 2 days passed faster than any in the week, and then day 6 arrived, and with it the final evaluation that Sarah Walker had promised would break most of them. At 0400 in the dark, she stood before the 12 exhausted Rangers and laid it out. "Today is the culmination of everything," she said. "You will conduct a full-scale operation against an opposing force, not training dummies, not me alone. A team of Tier 1 operators, the best this country has, who have agreed to come in and play the role of your enemy. They will not go easy on you. They've been told to win." She let that sink in. "Your objective is to penetrate their defenses, secure a high-value target, and extract. The odds are stacked against you on purpose. Some scenarios in this life are designed to be survived, not won. Today I want to see how you behave when winning isn't on the table. Because that, gentleman, is when a soldier's true character shows up." Briggs raised his hand. "Ma'am, what counts as passing if we can't win?" It was a good question, and Sarah's answer told them everything about what the whole week had really been for. "You'll know it when you do it," she said. "I'll know it when I see it. Now move." The operation began at first light, and it was by every measure a disaster from the start. The Tier 1 operators were on another level entirely. They anticipated the Rangers' first move and shut it down hard. Within the opening 20 minutes, 3 Rangers were eliminated from the exercise. The plan Briggs had built fell apart almost immediately, and the team scattered communications, breaking down the whole operation, teetering on the edge of total collapse. And here in the chaos, the old Ryan Mitchell wanted desperately to come back. Ryan could feel him clawing to the surface. The voice in his head that said, "Charge," that said, "Be the hero," that said, "This is your chance to prove everything. Go in alone, make them remember your name." His whole body was wired to do it. For 28 years, it had been his only answer to fear and failure. Go harder, go louder, go alone. He almost did it. He had actually started forward rifle up, ready to make some reckless solo push that would have gotten him killed in 90 seconds and accomplished nothing. And then in his mind, he heard her voice. Try to make sure the man next to you comes home. That's the whole job. Everything else is ego. He stopped. He pulled back into cover, his heart slamming, and he forced himself to do the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than any door he'd ever breached. Harder than any firefight he'd ever survived. He forced himself to think instead of charge. Doyle, he said into the radio, his voice steady now. Where are you? Pinned down east side. I've got Park with me. He's tagged out. I can't move. They've got two shooters on the high ground covering the only way out. The old Ryan would have told Doyle to make a run for it and take his chances. The new Ryan looked at the terrain, looked at the problem, and saw something else. Stay put, he said. Don't move. I'm going to pull their attention. When do you go? You hear me the second they react to me, you move. Ryan, if you draw them off, you're going to get tagged. There's no cover where you'd have to go. I know, Ryan said. There was a pause on the radio. You'd take yourself out of the exercise to get me clear. That's the job, Doyle, Ryan said. And as he said it, he understood for the first time in his life that he actually believed it. That's the only job. Go on my move. And then Ryan Mitchell, the man who had spent his entire career making sure he was the last one standing so everyone could see how tough he was, deliberately broke from cover into open ground, drawing every eye and every weapon on the opposing force toward himself, knowing exactly what it would cost him. And he did it without hesitation, because somewhere on a 4-mile walk that another woman had once made carrying a body, he had finally learned what those 4 miles had taught her. The Tier 1 shooters reacted instantly, swinging toward the exposed ranger, and in that half-second window, Doyle moved. He got Park clear. He got himself clear. And Ryan Mitchell took 2 training rounds center mass and went down, tagged out of the exercise exactly as he had known he would be. He lay there in the dirt, dead. And instead of the bitterness he expected to feel, instead of the failure, he felt something he had never felt after losing anything in his life. Peace. He had failed the objective. But for the first time, he understood that he had passed the only test that mattered. The exercise ground on without him, and here was the thing that none of them expected, least of all Ryan, from where he lay, watching. With Ryan's sacrifice, the dynamic of the whole team changed. Doyle fired up, started doing the same thing, covering instead of competing. Briggs picked it up. One by one, the surviving Rangers stopped trying to be heroes and started trying to keep each other alive. And a strange thing happened. They didn't win, the odds were too steep for that, but they stopped losing the way they'd been losing. They held. They adapted. They made the elite operators actually work for it. 2 of the Tier 1 men got tagged, which was almost unheard of for a group of students against a force like that. When that exercise was finally called, the Rangers were battered, most of them eliminated, none of them having reached the objective. By every conventional measure, they had failed completely. And Sarah Walker, watching from the command position, was quietly deeply satisfied. She gathered them one final time, filthy and exhausted and humbled, in the fading light of the longest day of the week. And before she said anything about the evaluation, she did something that surprised every one of them. She came to attention and she rendered them a slow, deliberate salute. The men froze. An instructor of her rank and her caliber saluting a group of students who had just lost. At the start of this week, she said, lowering her hand, 12 of the most arrogant men I'd ever met walked into my briefing room. You were good, you were talented, and you were one bad day away from getting yourselves and the men under you killed because every one of you believed your own legend. I've buried men like that. I told one of you the story. Her eyes found Ryan sitting at the edge of the group, still covered in dirt from the ground where he'd taken himself out of the fight. Today I watched something I rarely get to see. I watched men choose each other over themselves. I watched soldiers who 6 days ago would have run into that objective alone to be heroes instead, lay down their own success so the man beside them could keep going. You didn't reach the target. She paused. You did something harder. You became a team. And a real team beats a collection of heroes every single time in every war that's ever been fought. She let that hang in the air. Not all of you will receive a recommendation for advanced special operations selection. She continued, and the tension in the group spiked. That's the truth, and you've earned the truth. Some of you fought today, some of you grew, But growth and readiness aren't the same thing, and I won't lie to you to make you feel good, because a lie from me could get you killed somewhere. I'm not around to fix it. She pulled a folded paper from her vest. When I call your name, you've earned a recommendation. The rest of you, this isn't the end. It's a marker. Come back when you're ready, and I'll know it when you are. She read 4 names. Briggs was one, Doyle was another, 2 others followed, and then she stopped, folded the paper, and looked directly at Ryan Mitchell, who had not heard his name, who sat with his jaw tight, accepting it, telling himself it was fair, that after what he'd done in that bar, he had no right to expect anything, that maybe this was the cost he was always going to have to pay. But Sarah hadn't put his name on the list for a reason, because she wanted to say it herself out loud to his face in front of everyone. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, she said. Ryan looked up. Stand up? He got to his feet, every muscle aching. Sarah walked over to him, and she stopped a few feet away, and the entire group held its breath, because every one of them now knew the story of the bar. It had moved quietly through the ranks, the way these things always do, and they all understood the weight of this moment in a way that an outsider never could. 6 days ago, Sarah said, her voice carrying to every man there. This soldier did something to me that most people would never forgive. I won't pretend otherwise, and neither will he. He knows what he did. She didn't look away from him. And in 6 days, I have watched him do the single hardest thing a human being can do. I have watched him change. Not pretend to change. Not perform change for an evaluation. Change. Today he threw himself into the open and took himself out of the fight with nothing to gain so that the man beside him could live. That's not the soldier who walked into my briefing room. That's not even the soldier who walked into that bar. She extended her hand toward him. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, you have earned your recommendation, not because you became the strongest man in the room, because you finally became the kind of man other men can follow. For a moment, Ryan couldn't move. He looked at her outstretched hand and then at her face, at the bruise that had finally faded over the week. The bruise his own hand had put there, and his throat closed up completely. Ma'am, he managed, I don't deserve. I'll decide who deserves what. On my evaluation, Sergeant, Sarah said, and there was the faintest hint of warmth, almost a smile beneath the steel. Now take my hand before I change my mind. I took it. And the grip they shared was not the grip of an instructor and a student, and not the grip of a woman and the man who had wronged her. It was the grip of 2 soldiers who understood something about each other that no one else in the world quite could. The other Rangers, even the ones who hadn't made the list, broke into applause. Doyle was grinning so wide it looked like it hurt. Briggs, of all people, was nodding slowly with something like respect. And Ryan Mitchell stood there, shaking the hand of the woman he had struck, and he understood that he had been given something he could never have earned by being strong, fast, or brave. He had been given a second chance by the one person who would have been most justified in never giving him one. That night, after the others had gone, Ryan found Sarah outside alone, looking up at the stars the way she seemed to do when she thought no one was watching. Can't sleep, Sergeant, she said without turning around. No, ma'am. He came and stood a respectful distance away. I keep thinking about Danny, about what you told me. I can't stop thinking about it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. Don't stop. That's how you keep him alive. That's how you keep all of them alive, the ones we couldn't save. You carry the lesson so somebody else doesn't have to learn it the way we did. I'm going to be different, Ryan said, and his voice was thick. I swear to you, the way I lead, the way I treat my men, the way I carry myself. I'm going to be different. I don't ever want to be the reason somebody doesn't come home. I believe you, Sarah said. And then after a pause, but believing isn't the test. The test is 2 years from now, 5 years from now, when you've got rank and power in a unit that's afraid of you, and it would be so easy to go back to being the loudest man in the room, because the loud thing is always easier. The day you choose the quiet thing on a day when nobody's watching and nobody would ever know the difference, that's the day you'll know it really took. She finally turned to look at him. Most men talk about change the night they feel it. Few men live it on an ordinary Tuesday 3 years later, when it's hard and pointless and no one's keeping score. Be one of the few, Sergeant. For Danny, for your men, for the soldier you almost killed in a bar before you ever knew her name. Ryan nodded, unable to speak. Get some sleep, Sarah said gently. You've earned it. Tomorrow you go back to the world, and the world is where the real test starts. He turned to go, then stopped and turned back. Ma'am, one more thing. I never said it right. I never really said it. He stood straight and looked her in the eye. I'm sorry for what I did to you in that bar. There's no excuse. There's no version of it that's okay. I was a coward and a bully, and I hurt someone who'd done nothing but ask to be left alone. I'm sorry. I will be sorry for the rest of my life. And Sarah Walker looked at him for a long moment. This man she had every right to despise, and something in her face softened in a way it hadn't all week. I know, Sergeant, she said quietly. I've known since the morning you couldn't pull the trigger. She gave him a small nod. Apology accepted. Now go be the man you just promised to be. That's the only apology that ever really counts. Ryan walked back to the barracks under that wide field of stars, lighter than he had felt in years. The name Danny Reyes, a quiet vow now, instead of a ghost. And though he didn't know yet exactly how the rest of his life would unfold, what kind of leader he would become, what kind of men he would shape, he knew one thing with total certainty. I would spend every day of it trying to be worthy of the mercy. A small woman in a faded hoodie had shown him on the worst night of his life, when she had every reason in the world to destroy him, and chose instead to save him. The world, as Sarah had promised, was where the real test started, and it did not wait long to find Ryan Mitchell. 18 months passed. Ryan completed his advanced selection, the brutal pipeline that washed out most of the men who attempted it, and he came through it changed in a way the instructors couldn't quite name, but could absolutely see. He was still tough. He was still one of the most physically gifted soldiers any of them had handled. But there was a stillness in him now, a quiet that the old Ryan had never possessed, and the men around him felt it and trusted it. He was made a team leader, given 6 soldiers of his own, and the first thing he did when he stood in front of them was something none of them had ever seen a team leader do. I told them the truth about who he used to be. Before you decide what kind of leader you think I am, he said, you should know what kind of man I was. There was a night in a bar outside San Diego where I hit a woman across the face because she asked me to leave her alone. I was drunk and I was proud, and I thought being feared was the same thing as being respected. He let them sit with that, watching the discomfort move across their faces. That woman turned out to be one of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced. And instead of ending me, which she had every right to do, she taught me. So I'm going to lead you the way she taught me, which means I will never ask you to do something I won't do first. I will never spend your lives to make myself look good. And the day I become the loud, arrogant fool I used to be, I want one of you to look me in the eye and tell me, because that's the deal she made with me, and now it's the deal I'm making with you. The room was dead silent, and then his senior man, a quiet sergeant named Cole, said simply, copy that, boss. And something settled into place among the 7 of them that day, a foundation of trust that most teams take years to build, if they ever build it at all. But here is where the test truly came, the test Sarah had warned him about on that night under the stars, because it is one thing to make promises in a room full of soldiers when the feeling is fresh. It is another thing entirely to keep them on an ordinary day when it is hard and pointless and no one is keeping score. The day came during a deployment in a place Ryan would never be able to name. His team was set to execute an operation, one they had trained for, one that command wanted badly. And in the final hours before launch, Ryan looked at the intelligence and looked at the ground and felt something turn cold in his gut. The picture wasn't right, the same way it hadn't been right for Sarah and Danny all those years ago. The pieces didn't fit, and every instinct he had was screaming the same word, abort. But aborting meant calling command and telling them the operation they wanted, the one his team had bled to prepare for, the one that would have looked very good on Ryan's record, needed to be scrapped. It meant looking cautious. It meant looking to some like the team leader who lost his nerve. The old Ryan, the bar Ryan, would have pushed forward without a second thought, because the old Ryan cared more about not looking weak than about anything else in the world. And in that moment alone with the decision, Ryan Mitchell heard 2 voices. He heard Danny Reyes, a man he'd never met, saying, if we pull back now, we look weak. And he heard Sarah Walker saying, the day you choose the quiet thing when no one would ever know the difference, that's the day you'll know it really took. Ryan picked up the radio and called the abort. Command pushed back. A senior officer questioned him, hard, questioned his nerve, questioned his judgment. And Ryan Mitchell stood his ground, calm and certain, and said, sir, I'm telling you the intelligence is wrong, and I will not walk my men into it. You can relieve me if you want, but I'm not putting 6 soldiers in the ground to protect my reputation. That's my final call. They aborted. 3 days later, the intelligence was confirmed to have been catastrophically wrong. Had they gone in the after-action assessment, stated plainly the team would very likely have been lost. All of them. 6 men went home to their families because Ryan Mitchell had learned from a woman he once struck in a bar that real strength is having every reason to charge forward and choosing instead to make the hard, quiet, unglamorous call that keeps people alive. That night alone, Ryan did something he hadn't done in a long time. He cried. Not from fear and not from relief, though there was plenty of both. He cried because he finally fully understood what Sarah had given him and what it had cost her to be able to give it. He understood the 4-mile walk. He understood Danny. He understood that the lesson he'd carried for 18 months wasn't a story anymore. It was the reason 6 men were alive. It had moved from his head into his hands, and it had saved lives exactly the way Sarah had spent her entire life praying it would for someone, anyone, before it was too late. He found her contact information when he got home. He'd kept it all that time, but never used it, never felt worthy of using it. Now he sent a single message. 6 of my men are alive because of a call I made. I made it because of you. I made it because of Danny. I thought you should know that he saved them too. Thank you doesn't cover it, but it's all I've got. Respectfully, Mitchell. The reply came hours later, and it was short, and Ryan read it 100 times. That's the whole job, Sergeant. That's the only job. Danny would be proud. So am I. Now go do it again tomorrow. And he did. Year after year, he did it again. Ryan Mitchell became the kind of leader that young soldiers requested to serve under, the kind of name that got spoken with respect in the same low reverent tones that operators had once used for Sarah Walker. He was known throughout his units as the team leader who listened before he spoke, who protected before he judged, who never in his life looked at a quiet person in plain clothes and assumed they were weak. He passed the lesson down, the way it had been passed to him, and every soldier he shaped passed it down again. And in this way, the things Sarah had given him in a single week of training rippled outward across years and across men she would never meet. But the deepest moment, the one that closed the circle completely, came years later. Ryan had been asked to come speak to a class of young Rangers as a guest instructor. He stood at the front of a briefing room, a different briefing room in a different state, and he looked out at 12 confident, cocky, talented young men who reminded him so much of who he had once been that it almost hurt to look at them. And he saw sitting in the front row one young soldier in particular, loud gifted, certain he was the best man in any room, the heart of his little group, the one the others laughed with and feared a little, the kind of soldier who was one bad day from getting people killed. And Ryan understood in that moment why Sarah had done what she did. He understood the grief and the patience and the love it took to look at a man like that and refuse to give up on him. So Ryan Mitchell told them the story. He told them about the bar. He didn't soften. It didn't make himself the hero. He told them about the night he struck a woman across the face for asking to be left alone, and the morning she walked into his briefing room wearing the insignia of one of the most elite units in the country, and the weeks she spent teaching him instead of destroying him, and the 4 miles she once walked carrying the body of the best man she ever knew, and the 6 soldiers who were alive because of one phone call he'd had the strength to make. When he finished, the room was completely silent, and the loud young soldier in the front row, the cocky one, was staring at the floor with an expression Ryan recognized intimately because he had worn it himself on a bench years ago, with his whole world coming apart and reassembling into something better. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, Ryan said quietly. I'm telling you because somebody loved me enough to teach me instead of break me when breaking me would have been easier and more deserved. And I have spent the rest of my life trying to be worth it. That's the only thing I've got to give you that matters. Everything else, the tactics, the shooting, the fitness, you'll learn from better instructors than me. But this one thing I had to learn the hard way, and I'm trying to give it to you the easy way. Take it. Please, don't make somebody walk 4 miles before you understand it. The young soldier looked up at him, and after a long moment he said in a voice stripped of all its swagger, "How do I start, sir?" And Ryan Mitchell smiled because it was the exact question he had once asked a woman on a bench, and he gave the young man the exact answer she had given him. "One choice at a time," he said, "every single day, especially on the days when nobody's watching, and the prideful thing would be so much easier." That's the whole secret. There's nothing else to it. As for Sarah Walker, she never stopped. She trained class after class, year after year, taking the proudest and most dangerous young soldiers in the country and finding the gap between who they thought they were and who they actually were, and teaching them one by one the lesson that had cost her everything to learn. She never spoke much about the missions she'd run. She never displayed the medals locked in her drawer. She measured her life by a different accounting entirely. Because Sarah Walker had learned the deepest truth a warrior can learn, the one Danny had died teaching her, and that she'd spent the rest of her life passing on. Her greatest achievement was never the operations she'd completed in places the world would never know about. It was never the enemies she'd faced, or the medals she'd earned, or the impossible odds she'd walked through and survived. Her greatest achievement was the men she'd turned around, the Ryan Mitchells. The good soldiers she'd helped become better human beings, who then went on to save lives and shape other men, who saved more lives, an endless chain of decency, stretching out into a future she would never see. And every single time somewhere in the world a young service member chose humility over pride, chose the man beside them over their own glory, chose to control their strength instead of unleashing it, Sarah Walker's legacy grew whether she ever heard about it or not. So remember this, because it is the truest thing this story has to give you. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Never mistake quietness for fear. Never look at a person in plain clothes asking only to be left alone and assume you know the first thing about who they are or what they've survived. The strongest people you will ever meet are almost never the loudest. They are the ones who have every reason to strike back and choose again and again to build instead of break. Because true strength was never the power to dominate another human being. True strength is the discipline to control yourself when you have every reason in the world not to learn from your worst moment instead of being destroyed by it, and to become one quiet choice at a time a better person than you were the day before. Ryan Mitchell learned that lesson in a bar on the worst night of his life from a woman he had wronged, and it saved him, it saved his men, and it saved everyone those men would ever go on to protect. That is the legacy of a true legend, not the battles she won, the lives she changed, and that legacy never dies.